Dr. Sherry Zaks. Dr. Zaks is an assistant professor of comparative politics and methodology at the University of Southern California. They will be speaking to us today about their research topic, Repurposing Rebellion, How Today's Rebels Become Tomorrow's Parties. Dr. Zaks is joining us this year at CSEC as a visiting scholar, although they were also previously a CSEC fellow in the 2018-19 cohort. So their substantive work examines the conditions under which rebel groups are able to transform into political parties in the aftermath of civil wars. I'm really looking forward to hearing Professor Zaks talk today. Just a couple of rules of the road before we get started. One finger to get on the queue when we go to Q&A at the end. Two fingers to jump the queue to talk about for an immediate follow-up. We'll ask the CSEC fellows to ask the first couple of questions. If you're in the online audience, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. And for everyone, if you would please introduce yourself when asking a question, that helps our online audience know who's in the room. So without much further ado, Professor Zaks.
Hi, thanks so much. I turned it off because Harold was getting feedback. Now I'm here. All right, thank you so much. Still going to give it about a 40% chance that I trip over wires. That is part of the presentation. Okay, so countries beset by civil war face a host of uphill battles toward reconstruction, right? And even after wars end, there is no guarantee that a cessation of fighting actually means lasting peace. And for a while, research on the efficacy of civil war termination strategies was quite split and inconclusive. And some argued in favor of negotiated settlements, some for third-party monitoring, and others argued that we should just let the two sides fight it out until somebody eventually wins. More recently, though, we've found that one of the most tenable paths toward post-conflict stability and even democratization occurs when former rebels are allowed to create political parties and participate in post-conflict elections. And in light of this insight and a few high-profile success cases, two phenomena have really characterized the end of civil conflict since the late 80s. First, we've seen an upsurge in negotiated settlements granting former rebels amnesty and giving them the opportunity to become political parties in post-war governments. And second, and more surprisingly, we've actually witnessed a significant number of groups succeeding in this venture, right? And so what we have are battle-hardened insurgents trading combat fatigues and guns for khakis and campaign signs. And they've made really impressive showings at the ballot in doing so. But the question is, how did they do it? Because if we think about transforming a rebel group into a political party, it actually seems really odd to ever expect this outcome. But nearly 50% of rebel groups managed to refashion themselves into durable party organizations at the end of war. And this raises the question at the heart of my research. Why are some militant organizations able to seamlessly transform into political parties on the heels of war, while others die trying? And to be clear, this phenomenon is not just about getting enough signatures to register as a political party, right? Because rebel to party transformation means we have to take something that, at least according to much of the literature, looks like this, and turn it into something that looks like this: a party organization capable of building a political platform, forging linkages with society, winning elections, and governing. And again, only about 50% manage to fully transition into electoral politics, while the others fail, which subsequently raises the risks of conflict recurrence pretty substantially. And so the stakes of understanding which groups are capable of transformation and which are at risk for failure are really pretty high. And I'm going to argue today that to understand how an organization transforms from one into the other, what we need is a theoretical approach that places the structures and traits of the respective organizations at the center of the analysis. The problem with taking this approach, though, is that the mystery actually gets deeper before it gets better. Because one of the primary insights from organizational sociology is that organizational change isn't only hard, but it comes with a vastly increased risk of organizational death. One of my favorite quotes from the literature is, "Failing churches do not become retail stores." But in the case of rebel to party transformation, isn't this great though? I was like, I wonder if there are any. Turns out there are quite a few. In the case of rebel to party transformation, they certainly seem to. right? And so it's not to say that change never happens, but when it does, understanding it requires a very careful specification of the structures organizations have and what they need, and the process by which change unfolds, which political science just largely does not yet have the tools for. And so to situate this project more broadly, I'm going to quickly review the rebel to party literature to take stock of what we know about transformation and what questions are left unanswered. So the question is, why can't we get traction on this phenomenon, right? Because if we look at political science, we know a lot about rebellion and we know a lot about political parties. And I argue that what we don't know enough about is organizations and how organizational change works. And this deficiency comes to light when we examine both how scholars describe the rebel to party transformation process and how they explain it. And I'm going to go through these in turn. Now, scholars' descriptions of the transformation process is, okay, what it takes for a rebel group to build a political party includes the following tasks. They need to dismantle their combat units, reconfigure their decision-making structures, restructure their finances, recruit candidates, and build party structures. And this is a seemingly comprehensive to-do list that looks really great on paper, but it betrays a naive optimism about what organizations are actually capable of surviving. Because if we think about the organizational implications of taking a group and saying you've got 2 years to dismantle over half the organization, reconfigure your chain of command, restructure finances, and bring in new people to run it, any one of these on their own is massively destabilizing. They also compromise the legitimacy of organizations, and they tend to prevent organizations from adapting to changing environments, which is exactly what these organizations need to do while they're in the throes of change. And finally, while building party structures does seem like a kind of obvious task in becoming a party, no one really specifies what party structures are, what it takes to build them, or how rebels know what party structures are and what it takes to build them. And so I'm going to put a pin in this description and take a look at existing theories to see how much traction we could get on even explaining the phenomenon. And so rebel to party scholars rely on kind of 3 main factors to explain why some militant groups are more successful than others at building functioning parties. The first argument is that if they were a party before, they could recall those skills and become a party again, pre-war party experience. The problem there is that if the average civil war is lasting usually more than 10 years, there's no real reason to expect that electoral skills on the heels of war are going to be as sharp as they were going in. Because if any of you played an instrument in high school or college and I were to give you that instrument, my guess is that you would be a little bit rusty. And there's no real reason to believe that, that party skills are any different. Second, scholars argue that transformation is easier if organizations are centralized and cohesive with strong wartime bureaucracies. The thing is, these traits are really great if the goal is to avoid fragmentation at all costs, but they become extreme liabilities if the goal is to adapt to a changing environment, right? Because we don't normally associate bureaucracies with flexibility, which if anyone's had an issue with their pay or insurance at any point at any university, we know that, again, flexibility is does not comport with bureaucracy. And the third argument, which is pretty intuitive, right? Access to sufficient financial resources will make it easier to hire personnel, deal with startup and overhead costs of becoming a party. And obviously resources are a necessary condition to party building. The problem with this argument is that some organizations are going to be able to more efficiently redirect resources than others. And ultimately, we can only get so much traction on an organizational phenomenon like transformation when we propose explanations independently of the internal structures that mediate how effective each explanation would be. And the fact is, existing depictions don't account for the difficulty of organizational transformation, which makes both describing it and explaining it nearly impossible. And so the question is, what makes change easier in some cases than others? And turning to organizational theory, we find that while organizational change is always hard, it's not uniformly hard. And it's easier to the extent that groups have 2 properties. One, a general legacy of flexibility. And second, and most importantly, what we call transferable skills. Here, skills that are as useful for being parties as they were for being rebels. But this insight reveals its own problem because political science also lacks the conceptual vocabulary to specify the types and the diversity of skills that militant organizations, or really any organizations, have at their disposal. And to illustrate this, consider this drawing. Now, this is a sketch from a field diary of one of the commanders of the FMLN, which is the rebel group in El Salvador during the 1980s. Now, given the tools that we generally use in political science to describe organizations, we can specify that, this is a hierarchical group. We can assume perhaps or learn that it has a strong bureaucracy. We could say that it's likely not diffuse or fragmented. But all of these concepts describe only the shape of the organization and the strength of the chain of command. But this illustration depicts a multifaceted group with diverse wings that operate both inside and outside the combat domain. And here, we have full subdivisions. That doesn't work at all. Supposedly, there's a laser pointer there. Pretend I'm pointing to the right-hand side of the document. There are full subdivisions that are dedicated to press and propaganda, political education, domestic and international diplomacy, and a variety of others. And with these issues in mind, I built a theory that starts by questioning the conventional wisdom about the composition of rebel organizational structures. So rebel groups are generally modeled as though they comprise mostly full-time soldiers divided into sets of combat units, right? Something that looks like this. And I ask, what if not all rebel groups look like that? And instead, some look more like this, right? Where in addition to combat roles or combat subdivisions, we have full subdivisions dedicated to propaganda, full subdivisions dedicated to civilian administration. Others often look like this, where in addition to combat, we have some subdivisions dedicated to natural resource extraction and processing, and still others look like this, where we have press divisions and social service wings. And the empirical reality of rebellion is that reveals an unmodeled diversity in the roles and subdivisions that rebel organizations build during wartime. But the conflict literature hasn't caught up with a systematic way of incorporating this structural diversity into analyses of both the groups themselves and the Civil War outcomes that we really do care about. And I argue that this diversity, and specifically the variability in it across groups, is going to affect the prospects for successful transformation. And to see how, we're going to start by looking at the endpoint of transformation, the structure of political parties. And so similarly, breaking down and specifying organizational structures poses the same challenge for parties as it does for rebel groups. But digging into the literature, we can identify 3 core subdivisions that are common across political party organizations. I'm borrowing from a particular framework from Katz and Mayer, but broadly, we have a subdivision or a wing called the Party in Public Office, which is the contingent of members elected to office who do the governing. The Party on the Ground, which comprises the mass organizations in charge of building linkages with society, and the Party in Central Office, which is the wing that sort of builds the party platform and forges and disseminates party identity. And identifying the variety of roles within parties allows us then to specify the types of activities and the types of structures that aspiring rebels need in order to succeed in the political arena. And if change is easier, if groups have these pre-existing competencies or these transferable skills, the question is, are some rebel groups competent in these domains? And the answer is yes. And I identify a set of wartime organizational subdivisions that I call proto-party structures, which map onto these party divisions and have key implications for the likelihood and the process of rebel to party transformation. And the 3 core proto-party structures are rebel governance wings, or wings dedicated to shadow governance and administration, wings that provide social services, which broadly map onto the party in the ground by forging linkages with society, and political messaging and press divisions, which map onto the party in public office by generating and sort of releasing the organization's political ideology. And so functionally, these wartime structures mirror the key elements of party organizations, but not all rebel groups build them. And I argue that proto-party structures will confer 2 advantages to groups as they attempt to transform into political parties. The first is that these subdivisions that engage in party-like activities will imbue the organization with relevant and structured skill sets. The second advantage comes to light when we consider how you actually build a party out of the pieces of rebels. So the second part of my theory identifies 2 possible pathways toward post-war party building. Now, recall that rebel to party scholars almost uniformly posit that the transformation process entails building a party from scratch once the war ends. And to be fair, if rebel organizations look like this, which some of them do, right, combat-centric organizations with a fairly homogeneous set of roles, the process of transforming is going to proceed exactly the way the literature says it will, right? All of these units are going to have to be dismantled, and the governing and platform building and outreach structures are going to have to be built in their place, right? So in short, nearly the entire organization is going to have to be rebuilt. But that process is highly disruptive and greatly increases the risk of failure. And while this is the situation that some find themselves in, my theory points to another possible path to transformation. Because if alternately, a rebel organization looks like this when the war ends, then transforming into a political party doesn't necessarily involve dismantling everything and building from scratch. Since this group has an existing set of party-like structures and skill sets, transforming into a political party can actually just occur by bolstering the relevant structures, augmenting them, hiring a few more personnel, and then only dismantling what's no longer needed. And this repurposing is the mechanism by which proto-party structures facilitate the rebel to party transformation process. And so I'm going to move on now to how I test this theory empirically. I test this theory in the paper using within-group comparative process tracing to trace the transformation of the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front in El Salvador. This casework draws on over 400 archival documents from 6 archives across El Salvador and the US, dozens of recorded interviews and radio broadcasts from the war, and a handful of published individual histories. And I'm going to provide just a little bit of background to contextualize the case. So in response to growing oppression from the Salvadoran government, 5 groups with 5 very different approaches to rebellion sprung up throughout the 1970s. I'm going to apologize for this. The FPL, the ERP, the RN, the PCS, and the PRTC. There will not be a quiz on this, I promise. Each of these groups was vying for Cuban support to try to get like the one true rebellion off the ground. And ultimately, after the Sandinista victory in Nicaragua, Castro agreed to support a Salvadoran revolution under one condition, that the groups unite. And so 2 months before their first incursion into the country, they came together to form the FMLN, which was an umbrella organization headed by a 5-man council, 1 person from each of the subsequent groups. And so that's all fine and well, but you should be asking, why the FMLN? Why is this case ideal? And a few key features of this organization create an unparalleled opportunity for an analysis of the theory I just presented. The first, quite frankly, is that the groups hated each other. So merging wasn't just logistically complicated, it was like morally abhorrent to everyone involved. Adding to that, Castro and the leaders were in a rush to get the rebellion off the ground. And in light of these 2 issues, they made a snap decision at the beginning of the war that shaped the FMLN well into the 90s, or arguably the 2000s. They allowed every subsequent group to retain their own organizational structures. And the third reason this case is ideal is that they completely bungled their insurrection into the country. It was supposed to overthrow the Salvadoran government in 2 to 3 days, and they completely bungled it for a number of reasons. And after this failure, each constituent group retreated to a different area of the country where they largely remained throughout the war. And together, these circumstances give rise to a really unique geo-organizational phenomenon that makes the FMLN an absolutely ideal case. Because what we had are 5 different groups with 5 views on rebellion and 5 different organizational structures operating in distinct areas where they fought under the same name against the same regime for the same outcome. And most importantly, these groups differed considerably in the extent to which they built proto-party structures throughout the war. And this allows me to test how organizational structures affect the transformation process while holding just about everything else constant. To make the analysis a little bit more tractable, I'm going to focus on 2 groups in 2 different areas, the ERP in Morazan and the FPL in Chalatenango. Now, these were the 2 largest groups within the FMLN. Each formed their rearguard among very poor rural peasants or campesinos. And some quick background on the two areas, which will become relevant later. Both areas, again, were extremely poor, and they were very heavily influenced by liberation theology, which in practice meant that local populations in these areas, but few others, had some experience with political engagement and organization, which was otherwise illegal in that period, right? Any organizing, like any social organizing, was illegal outside of actual just being social or religious organizations. And so in short, what we have are two Marxist groups of similar size who were part of the same organization, who built rear guards among similar social networks in roughly the same socioeconomic context. Now, every single explanation in political science would have us expect these groups to build similar organizational structures and eventually to have a roughly equal share of influence in the post-war party. The catch is that the ERP and the FPL had very different views on what rebellion should entail. And I'm going to trace how their organizations evolved and what the implications were for transformation. Now, of course, the FMLN was still supposed to work as a unified front. And in the first phase of the war, the strategic directive from the top was to rebuild forces ahead of a second insurrection. And for their part, ERP leaders adhered to a T. They believed that all that was needed to mount a successful rebellion was a sufficiently strong military, and that these sort of like grandstanding shows of force would incite popular mobilization kind of inevitably. And so their focus was exclusively on bolstering combat structures by any means necessary. And even though then the organization was built on these highly politicized social networks with really intense government grievances, the ERP viewed them as little more than potential recruits and logistical support. And this is evident in letters and interview transcripts with the ERP leadership. Right, and this quote betrays a very unidimensional understanding of what local populations could contribute to rebellion. Right, we move with the masses because we depend on them. Right, without them, we would not have human reserves or we wouldn't have supplies. And the ERP remained fairly steadfast in this laser focus on militancy throughout the war, even when other groups enjoined them to branch out. And I'll demonstrate how this affected the transformation process in a bit, but I'm going to turn now to Chalatenango, where a very different story unfolded. And so while the FPL was technically operating under the same strategic directive, they took a very different tack. After being told to prepare for another insurrection, they did what any good Marxists would do. They taught people how to read. They also deeply engaged the politicized religious networks in the area, and their priorities had very clear organizational implications. They emphasized developing grassroots governance structures, which they built by repurposing pre-war religious networks among locals to actually create democratic participatory institutions where citizens could organize politically. They created a radio wing and a press division to disseminate their political message, and they leveraged their affiliation with the Radical Teachers Union to develop a very robust education wing and a formal curriculum that they used to not only provide schooling to members, but to local populations as well. Here's actually a page from one of the FPL's literacy books. And what this illustrates is that even from very early on in the war, the FPL's proto-party structures were sophisticated and they were highly institutionalized. And before I move on to talk about how these different organizational structures affected transformation, I'm going to forestall an important question. Did the rebels know what they were doing at the time? The answer is yes, they did. So here are two quotes from two different groups about halfway through the war. Both come from internal documents detailing their respective organizational goals. And the first is tasks: form cadres with specialized party objectives so that their eventual promotion organically strengthens the party because we have the core elements already in place. And the second, to create in the process of struggle organizational structures that are guaranteed to work after the conflict. Right? Because for my theory to hold, rebels can't just build politically relevant structures. They have to know that these structures have post-war utility. And with that in mind, we're going to look at the transformation process. So quickly take stock of the facts leading up to transformation. Right? So as part of the settlement, the FMLN was given the opportunity to participate as a political party in the 1994 elections. And the internal directive in light of this opportunity was that each group would have equal representation and equal say in the new party and the party formation process. If I'm right, however, I don't expect the party building process to play out that way in practice. I expect instead that groups that ended the war with proto-party structures already in place will emerge as leaders in the new party because they have these transferable skills ready to go. And in contrast, I expect the ERP, despite being the largest and most well-funded group throughout the war, to falter. And to test these expectations, I'm going to compare internal narratives about the transformation process. On the next set of slides, I'm going to present two sets of quotes, one from groups with robust proto-party structures built during wartime, and the other from the ERP. And what we find is two very different conversations about the same task. And let's take a look at the first set. So we have here from the FMLN General Command, we're in a period where we must have the capacity to translate our political capital developed during wartime to the moment when there's peace in El Salvador. From the FPL, we can reorient our local popular power structures and control mayorships. From the PCS, from the Communist Party, we've accumulated democratic and revolutionary cadres with strategic value. They've been developed under the conditions of dual political military power, which puts us in a very good position to succeed. The next one, I swear I didn't make this up. This is one of those quotes that you find once in a career. All of our structures and men will follow three paths. The fighters will go to agricultural production on the lands we have left. A percentage of the structures will go to the National Civil Police, and another percentage of the structures will go to the political party organization into which we're going to transform. Now, these quotes are optimistic and they're very concrete, right? They demonstrate not only that leaders understood the value of their wartime structures, but that they were confident in the ability to convert them into the party organization moving forward. And in contrast, the discussions inside the ERP were really quite bleak. We need to discuss how we're going to shape political structures. We need to discuss the principles of political party organization and create the functional structure that binds the union, social, judicial, and electoral struggles into a single effort. We recognize that many of the organizational lines we've promoted have been in service of the war. And the ERP has established that it is being reimagined in light of the new struggle. We humbly recognize that we need other capacities for the new challenges. Right, and these quotes verify that one, the ERP structure was considerably more homogeneous than the others and that leaders knew it. And this last quote really shows that leaders recognize the limitations of that homogeneity. And so I'm just going to conclude with how the transformation process unfolded on the ground. Despite the internal directive for equal representation, clear frontrunners emerged immediately, right? So the FPL and the Communist Party emerged as backbones within the new party within just a few months of party formation. And as for the organization itself, examples of the sort of structural repurposing I expect abound throughout. The FPL's press division became the press division of the new political party. The Salvadoran Association for Local Development and Democracy was repurposed to help mobilize voters. Cadres in charge of the territorial administration and land allocation during the war were repurposed to facilitate the land transfer program. And so ultimately, after being marginalized in the transformation process, the ERP actually broke off from the FMLN, attempted to form their own party, and they failed and disbanded within a year. And so the core takeaway here is that while rebel to party transformation is a common opportunity that's granted to militant organizations after war, the ability to take advantage of that opportunity after the conflict depends largely on their wartime organizational legacies. And the reality is that some groups come to the negotiating table looking a lot more like parties than others, and these groups are the ones who are most likely to succeed at the ballot and beyond it. The research has implications for both scholarship and policy, but I want to. Am I about out of time? Do I have a second? Okay, I'm going to quickly run through the implications. So on the scholarship side, at the most narrow, this has vast implications for how we understand rebel to party transformation by giving us newfound traction on the mechanism. It also brings to the conflict literature the idea of taking organizational approaches and how we can use them to shed new light on old questions. And finally, it helps bridge the gap between both conflict literature on the one hand and the political party literature on the other hand. And as for policy, knowing what we know now about which groups are more likely a priori to be able to transform into political parties, this could allow us to better tailor negotiated settlements at the end of conflict by building in contingencies for not to say that we shouldn't give groups the opportunity to try, but we could build in contingencies for groups that are likely to fail. It also has implications for the microdynamics of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration processes. DDR programs are generally structured to demobilize what we consider to be just combatants, who we generally consider to be young men between the ages of 16 and 34. And the fact is, it's like a huge percentage of the rebels in El Salvador had they had as many PhDs in the rebellion as we have in this room. And we have, there are writers and there are, radio operators and engineers, and, giving people the sort of pittances of a demobilization process where it's like, oh, you can have a little bit of farmland is not actually going to work well for everybody. And you might actually have more luck getting people to commit to demobilization if there are tailored demobilization institutions. And it also gives us understanding how rebel organizations are structured, and the diversity within rebel organizations gives us a new understanding of rebel recruitment profiles, which could presumably help people better target where militant group recruitment is coming from. All right, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions. All right.
Thank you very much, Sherry. I think we'll open for Q&A. Again, one finger to get on the queue. I see Caleb already, and Rhiannon. And then if you're online, please use the Q&A function on Zoom.
Thank you, Sherry. This is fantastic. I'm Caleb Pomeroy, Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow here at CSAC. Which organizational structure, the more combat versus kind of participatory structures, which one is more likely to emerge victorious in the rebellion? Because it seems like there might be a trade-off between investing your resources in combat units versus investing your resources in your education and propaganda units. And it would be kind of counterintuitive if the groups with these proto-party structures actually produce better fighters as well. Thanks. Yeah,
that's a really good question. So in terms of assuming that negotiated settlements toward party transformation doesn't exist, are groups that allocate finite resources toward diversity less likely to succeed militarily. I've had this question kind of in the back of my mind, and so far I've kind of found mixed evidence, but the evidence itself is a little bit anecdotal, and it's very likely to suffer a few types of selection effects. The fact is the diversity of structures is a lot more common than we think, but I am not as likely to believe that. So there's a selection effect story, which is if they have the resources to build proto-party structures, they might also be more likely to have good resources to train good fighters. So if we take, for example, the RUF in Sierra Leone, which was a very, very homogenous organization that was mostly forced recruitment of very young kids. They didn't diversify their structures. They also weren't very good militarily. They were just kind of brutal. And that might also be a resources story. And so it's a good question. There's reasonable evidence that could go either way, but it's something I've thought about.
Okay. Rhiannon?
Great. Thanks so much, Sherry. Rhiannon Nielsen, I'm the cybersecurity postdoctoral fellow here. I have a sort of two-pronged question. This was fascinating, and I'm going to ask you to go even more deep into the actual internal dynamics of the parties themselves. So this is kind of a quiz because I can't quite remember the two parties that you were talking about. Was it the FLP and the ERP?
ERP, yeah, FPL, ERP.
Oh, great. Okay, amazing. So you were talking about how the structures of a lot of these groups were made up with writers and people with PhDs and educated people. Did you find that there was a concentration of those kinds of people within the FPL as opposed to the ERP? Was the ERP more made up of buying into stereotypes like the farmers and the sort of more uneducated groups? And then the second part of my question is kind of piggybacking off what Caleb said. Do you think there was a greater recognition among those successful groups that it's not just about the bombs and bullets? Like you can be more successful if you're leveraging the population. And so that was the reasoning behind it, as opposed to concentrating all their efforts into munitions and combat resources.
Yeah. So good question. The answer to the first one is yes, they were more concentrated in the FPL because they actually the FPL split off from the ERP because they're like, you guys are you just want to shoot things. Can we please just not? And so part of it is a function of like like all of the nerds were like, we're gonna like build our own organization and like we should just write a bunch. And so. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Remind me your second question. Prompt me your second question.
Yeah, it's because they were successful and then recognizing it's not just about the bullets and the ammunition.
Yeah, but one of the problems was arguably they were more successful in recognizing that, but there are a lot of groups that want to be able to build these structures that also can't because they don't have the resources to. So it's actually not just about the recognition, it is about the being able to execute on it. And yeah, but there was on the flip side of that, there was very much an intransigence on the side of the ERP, where they were like, we're just going to remain militant. This is the way to do it. This is the way to mobilize, because they were like, we're going to galvanize support and we're going to like, you know, blow a lot of things up. And so, yeah.
I actually put myself next on the list, but I have some other people on the list as well. So I'll go ahead and ask. You brought up, you briefly mentioned some of the international influences on the different organizations, Salvador. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that, whether that translated into choices about organizational structure, because as you know, the Soviet Union, traditional Marxist-Leninist parties had one theory of victory. In fact, they thought these countries were still feudal, so we're not ready for revolution in certain cases. There's the Chinese model, sort of rural rebellion, seizing power at the end. And then there's sort of the Cuban Focismo, a small band of determined fighters can, lead the country into revolution by spurring popular uprising, as occurred in Cuba. And so to what extent are these different international influences affecting the organizational choices of the groups? And did one model do better?
That's such a great question. I'm like so thrilled about this because I'm literally working on a paper right now called #NotAllMarxists. Specifically one of the reasons that I love this case, which I didn't have a chance to get into, is because they broadly subscribe to Marxist-Leninist ideology, but we see Focismo in the ERP, and and we see the FPL took a much more Maoist approach, and so the fact is, though, because their patron was Cuba, for the most part, Cuba was not the one that was influencing their organizational structures per se. And I'm actually, that's the sort of next branch of my work is that what we find is a really intense distinction between the dogmas to which organizations subscribe and the organizational ideology that they sort of derive from it, which they use then to guide both the structures that they build and the behaviors and the sort of principles of war that they follow thereafter. And so I do think that there might be some, like I could say based on this that Focismo is not particularly great for the rebel to party transformation thing, but
it wasn't particularly great.
It wasn't particularly great for a lot of things. That's true. But yeah, the international influences, you see considerably less on organizational structure than you might otherwise expect.
That's great. So let me go to Max and Jim next, and I also have a couple of people on this, but I'm going to work in an online question in the middle of that. So let's go to Max first, then to Jim Colgar.
Hi, Sherry. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm Max, a computer science postdoc here at CSAC, SARI, and the Center for AI Safety. I was wondering, with Hamas and Gaza in mind, can you view through the lens of your work, explain to me the difference between a terrorist group and a rebellion group, please?
Sure. Terrorism is a strategy, just as the the people are our mountains is a like terrorism as it's defined, which is, the use of fear to inspire, political action, right, is a wartime strategy. One could argue that there are a variety of terror. I mean, like one of the groups in here, they really liked blowing up bridges because it was just to like mess up the infrastructure and show how bad the state is at fixing it. That would be considered a terrorist tactic, right? If some group blew up a bridge in the United States, we would say, oh, that's terrorism. The fact is, there's really no such thing as a terrorist group. It's just that there are a variety of non-state armed groups, some of which use what we call terrorist tactics to as part of their strategies of achieving results. But Hamas is I also do a bunch of quantitative work on this. Hamas is a group in my data set because they similarly, had, a variety of these sort of like, they were a rebel group, they have these press wings, they do all sorts. Yeah.
Great. Let's go to Jim now.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim Goldgeier, visiting scholar here at CSAC. And thanks for such a great talk. That was really, was great. I learned a lot. And what I really kept thinking during the talk was like, well, yes, this seems so obvious for a group to do this. Why aren't other groups doing this? Why are other groups failing? And you mentioned a couple times, some groups are just bad at it, including being bad at the military strategy as well. But I was just curious because you didn't mention leaders much. I mean, is there a role here for individual leaders in terms of why some groups are more successful at this than others? And also, is there any learning that like are these people learning from other situations that they're seeing, or are they parochial enough that they only know their own situation and there's no question of learning? But those were the two things I was just curious about, as I just was trying to think about why the FMLN was so much more successful than other groups that you've looked at might be.
Yeah, that's a really great question. The fact is, the leaders have a lot of agency at some areas of organizational building. So if we're going to take a kind of classic political science, like our historical institutionalist approach to this, leaders are going to have a lot more agency over the forms that their organization takes at early stages and at critical junctures than throughout, because organizations kind of end up having a sort of path-dependent life of their own thing. Why other groups aren't doing it? There are a lot of leaders who just don't want to do it. I mean, so the ERP absolutely had the resources to do it. They were affiliated with the same Radical Teachers Union. They built on the same social networks. They could have done it. The leader didn't want to. Similarly, I brought up the RUF in Sierra Leone. The leader, like I have this great quote from a former fighter that was like, he preferred the loyalists. He did not like the educated ones. And so he continued, Fode Senko continued to marginalize what was originally the core of the RUF, which was a bunch of exiled college professors and students who wanted to create this much more diverse structure. But when he emerged as a leader, he wasn't doing it. And it was specifically out of fear or ego or something to that extent. As far as organizational learning is concerned, they aren't so parochial that they don't know what's going on in other contexts. The funny thing about the RUF is that one of the things they said early on in the war is, we want to do a Renamo. And so they knew what had happened. At this point, it was 5 or 6 years ago. They just didn't think about what it would actually take to do that.
All right. Let me work in an online question from Graham Davies, and this relates to maybe your broader quantitative work, which can you reflect on sort of the lessons learned from El Salvador that might be applicable elsewhere, or other examples that might have something in common with El Salvador? For example, he gives Palestine or Northern Ireland. We also have multiple groups, non-state actor groups.
So this is an excerpt from a larger book project that engages in 2 cases from South Africa in the book. So I look at the RUF as a failure and Renamo in Mozambique as a success. And I do also have a quantitative data set that codes, to the extent that it can, diversity of militant organizational structures worldwide up through it's 2019 now. And so the lessons do carry, it travels fairly well. And we see different factors are, affect groups a little bit more in some cases. Some groups are just incredibly resilient to change. And so what Renamo lacked in the resources and the literacy to be able, because they had an 8% literacy rate, so they weren't going to teach a lot of people how to read during the war. But they did have an incredibly flexible organization, and they were able to incorporate people into it very easily while mitigating those sorts of tensions. But yeah, I mean, so I have actually a variety of Palestinian groups. So the PLFP, DLFP, and Hamas as part of it as well. And yeah, it travels fairly well and is common. And again, going back to your question, it also carries across ideological bents.
Great. I have 2 on this side of the table. I think the person, yeah. Okay.
Thanks. We're friends, and as you'll find out in a second, colleagues. Thanks so much for this talk. It was really interesting. My name is Andres Uribe. I'm a postdoc downstairs in CGDRL. And I guess I wanted to ask you maybe your take on 2 potential alternative explanations that haven't come up yet, or sort of have, but maybe not as much as they could. One is about the role of ideology that I think was mentioned, which is, I imagine that some groups are sort of more committed, not just in taking power, but in democracy itself, the democratic process itself. They're more prepared because this is something they sort of know about and care about from beforehand in a way that possibly leads to organizational structures, but isn't caused by them. Then relatedly, sort of what is the role of the voters or the masses or the constituents in all of this, right? Does it matter that, could it be the case that some groups that have these governance structures, et cetera, also just have more popular support? And how does that translate then into the success of political parties? The sort of case I have in the back of my mind here is the case of the FARC in Colombia, which has this incredibly robust, differentiated, bureaucratic structures, but does terribly, right, post-2016. How would your theory account?
Yes, they thank God for their quota system, which I think is coming to a close next year. Poor guys. Okay. So the first question in terms of, I'm going to actually separate role of ideology from commitment to democracy. So one of the scope conditions that I place on, I'm not going to call this, I'll tell you in a minute why this isn't a cop-out, but it's going to sound like a cop-out, and that's okay. One of the scope conditions that I place on the analysis, though, is you have to, at some point during your conflict, say that you want to be a party, right? I'm not going to include Boko Haram in this, and I'm not going to include, ISIS in this. They don't want to be a party. There's actually, and then also because with the nature of transnational organizations, there's no clear target state necessarily in which they would become a party. And so I think there's a certain extent to which an ideological commitment to, or at least okayness with democracy, needs to be a scope condition on understanding rebel to party transformation. And yeah, because, and so what I would argue is just that what we are dealing with are 2 fundamentally different types of armed actors, right? And so I would say that groups that aren't willing to, show up at a ballot alongside the other belligerents in war, that represents a difference in kind rather than a difference in degree of a sort. And this is one of the issues with, how we consider organization, like rebel organizations. We don't have a lot of different ways of parsing where there are actually differences in kind. And even where we expect to see like the FMLN, they started their war, they were like, we're not doing the democracy thing. We want full revolution. And then in 1983, they were like, well, a little democracy as a treat would be nice. And so what we actually see is a change in organizational ideology over the course of the war when they start to assess what is and isn't possible. As for the role of the voters, so the rebel to party story is actually kind of two outcomes rolled into one. On the one hand, there's this internal organizational transformation. This paper focuses on that because I think it's cool. We get to look, I get to do a lot of fun archival research and get FMLN Christmas cards. There is also the question of rebel to party transition, which is the actual transition into electoral politics and what governs that. And so this role of voters kind of deals with the demand side aspect, and so that's sort of like the second question. This explains the supply side. What allows you to be a party? I do actually argue, and I can show this with sub-state data in El Salvador, which I might have a slide about, that groups that created proto-party structures during war perform better at the municipal level than the more homogenous groups, even where there wasn't forced conscription and there wasn't terribly, like, people had similar, like, favorability levels between like the ERP and like some of the others, but people voted for the FMLN in droves where the proto-party structures were there. One might argue that that's a function of like, oh, this is like favorable, you taught us how to read. The other thing is, in places where there were these really robust institutions, they were able to not, it's voter mobilization isn't the issue, it's voter registration that's the problem. Proto-party structures give rebels the ability, or rebel successor parties, the ability to actually register and mobilize and do all the institutional stuff that you need to do before you can actually get voters to vote for you at the ballot. And that's what we actually find there.
Okay. Before we go to Ken, I think there was one more just to the right of you, or you were the second person? Okay. Okay.
My name is Maria Curiel. I'm also a postdoc at CDDRL. So Andres and I came up here together. Yeah, got lost on our way here. So I also study rebel to party transition, super inspired by your work. My focus on the case of the FARC, and something I've thought a lot about in my work. So I'm curious as to whether and how you've thought about it, is civilians and their recruitment, not just as voters, but their recruitment and integration into rebel parties, like their function within the party bureaucracy and even in party leadership. So is that a part of the story here? And do you see that the extent to which they can incorporate militant civilians matters, or not?
When you say civilian recruitment into the party, when you say civilian, you mean people who were
non-combatants, people that weren't like within the formal structure of the FMLN in this case, sympathizers.
I kind of take it, since we're in the same thing, and I'm sorry to everybody else, I take a very Libby Wood approach to the idea, and I'm just like, who is a civilian though, really? Because it's like, it's so hard. Like if somebody is, if a government official comes to somebody's door and they say, we would like to root out the FMLN, and they were like, yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know where they are. And like, there's 6 in their attic, but they're not carrying a gun. Is that person a civilian? Is the person a civilian who like makes tortillas for the, and so the fact is there is a lot of people who were part of the community organizations, and like just like participants in the community did get kind of funneled into the party organization or affiliated unions thereafter. I just kind of get squicked out about the concept of civilians. Like I did a search and like delete for the word civilian in the book because I like get so, what's a civilian about it?
Maybe the distinction between militants and fighters. You can be a militant.
But even
not carry a gun.
Like, but this is the problem. Is I was going to.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
They're part of the same structure.
Yes.
But they might have different functions. But let's go to Ken, and then I have Cameron, and that's I think where we might stop. So.
Hi, Ken Schultz, political science. Great talk, Sherry. I guess my question is about what explains some of the variation in the rebel organizations in the first place. And you already just mentioned, for example, ISIS and Boko Haram, who they have no interest in this, and they probably wouldn't even accept looking for a deal that makes them a party, which seems to be like the starting point of your analysis. Is we start with a deal that we've accepted. So there's going to be a set that aren't going to want that. But I'm also thinking about there must be lots of rebel groups that are operating in such repressive environments where they don't have their press office and they don't have government. They just can't do any of that stuff because they don't have territorial control. They just don't have the ability to do that. And I'm just wondering, like, so do they ever end up as parties, or are these groups just doomed to fail?
I would argue that the FMLN was in a really, really repressive state. I mean, like there was a complete, like one of the things that started the war in the first place was that there were numerous like full media blackouts. The government was blackbagging somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people per year. Like it was really indiscriminately. And you do find a diversity of structures, even in places where the government actually has the reach to kind of quash them out. And you also see so the FPL controlled a lot of territory because they were kind of in the sort of rural hinterlands of El Salvador. The Communist Party mostly operated out of San Salvador. And one of the things we don't talk about is the fact that they had a very robust press division. They certainly didn't control territory, right? Because they were in the middle of the city. And we don't really talk about like urban territorial control. And so territorial control, it becomes a little bit less, it's more about how good you are at being sneaky, which, is difficult to quantify. And to the first question about what explains the variation in rebel organizational structures in the first place, this is a really important one. What I find, I use organizational ideology as sort of this inroad into determining how rebels are at nascent stages in the rebellion are allocating their resources and leveraging social networks to build these structures. And you can actually find, I have just oodles of documents of sort of the rebellion is official, talking about what types of structures they want to build that comport with how they believe the war ought to be fought. And so there is quite a bit of we think our organization should be structured this way because this is what it means to fight the type of rebellion that we want to fight. And again, it's one of the reasons that I like using this case, or that I find this case to be so analytically useful, is because for the most part, the overall goals of the organization remained the same. And so it's not just that we find these very systematic differences between what ISIS builds, which I argued 5 minutes ago was a difference in type, versus groups that are willing to come to the table.
Just a quick two-finger on this. What interesting thing to follow up on would be, I understand in the El Salvador case, there were actually some pockets on the Salvador-Honduras border that did serve as rear guards left over from this Honduras-El Salvador War in 1969 that were neither the Honduras or the Salvador military would go in there to avoid another conflict. And so those were rear bases that might be the closest you got in El Salvador to areas that were sort of truly rebel held. The interesting counterexample might be to look at Argentina and where do the left Peronists who make up the left-wing fighters during the 70s end up in the political parties in the 1980s, because the Peronist Party is still dominant after the Dirty War. So there might be a way of getting at this question using slightly different set of cases. Yeah. Let's go to Cameron for the last question.
Cameron Tracy, research scholar at CSAC. I was wondering how typical what you saw in this case is, where you had multiple rebel groups competing with one another to achieve this successful transformation. And if that's not always the case, looking at your larger data set, are there aspects of this proto-party apparatus that helps these groups compete with other groups to make a successful transformation that wouldn't necessarily be helpful if they were doing so in the absence of other groups, or vice versa?
That's a really good question. Yeah, the nature of competition in the Salvadoran case is really interesting, because technically they were all they were all entitled to the same thing, right? These 5 groups were under an umbrella. They should have all gotten equal representation and whatnot. And I think it did help them edge out people who they didn't want there. As far as how common we see how frequently we see the same dynamic of intergroup competition, It's a lot more difficult because the cases where we have multiple rebel groups, like multiple non-state armed groups operating, are really difficult cases to kind of parse. So we see that in like the DRC and in Chad, where we had multiple rebel groups, and what parties they maybe transitioned into or what parties recruited from different groups is so murky that they are mostly cut out of every data set that claims to study this. And so I am not sure is really the answer, because the dynamics of a state such that multiple non-state armed groups are continually functional are likely just so dire that it's difficult to imagine that suddenly a multi-party democracy is going to erupt instead of war. And it's also hard because then you have to do multi-party negotiated settlements, and so usually the war doesn't stop in this way that allows elections to function. And so this type of competition often happens in the context of like umbrella organizations, which are like somewhat common, but actual like true competition between rebellions, I truly don't know.
All right. Well, I think unfortunately that's all the time we have. There's a couple of questions left online that I'll pass on to our speaker, but please join me in thanking Professor Zaks for a fascinating talk.